Please be seated. Welcome. Every week is different here at St. John's. We're so grateful for the Labyrinth and for the opportunity to, in a ritualistic way, to remind ourselves that we walk together and we walk in not so straight a path, with a lot of twists and turns, and we walk towards God. I think as I read this passage today in the Gospel, I got hung up on this grim sense of having no options, of seemingly to try every possible angle to heal the gulf and the gap between heaven and hell, if you will. Abraham responds in the story that Lazarus had suffered evil and you did not. Besides, there is a great chasm. And then he thinks about his own family, and he asks him to send Lazarus to warn them, and Abraham responds, as he did so beautifully, that you have everything you need. The message has come over and over and over again, and even if someone rises from the dead, if you haven't received that message, you won't. There are times in our lives when we experience great chasms, when we experience that feeling of not being able to get from point A to point B. And we so want to make that happen. And we try everything in our power to make that happen. I like to point out that this story, as the epistle points out, is not about the rich and the poor, at least not entirely. The story is about someone avoiding their suffering and someone who is in touch with their suffering. That is the contrast. Somebody who knew what it was like to suffer, and someone who never suffered or never was in touch with their suffering. So we are like the rich man. We are like the rich man if we avoid self-reflection, if we avoid our grief, our own suffering, our own feeling. And the purpose, there's a purpose and a way forward in all of this, but it requires letting go of the paradigms that we use to protect ourselves from being vulnerable. This rich man was rich with his paradigms to keep people away, to not look at his own suffering. And if he's that isolated, he's suffering. If he's that disconnected, he's suffering. Because as far as I can tell, the definition of suffering, biblically speaking, is disconnection. Not belonging. Not being part of a compassionate effort, if you will. And look at his MO, because you can tell he hasn't given up his paradigm when he doesn't say Lazarus. He's talking to Abraham. Abraham, have that guy take care of me. He's still caught in that stratification of rich and poor, servant and master. It would be an entirely different story if he didn't see Abraham, but he just saw Lazarus. Lazarus, I had no idea of the suffering that you've been going through. Forgive me. That's a different story entirely. It's a story of empathy, not someone running in fear of their suffering. And so he never felt empathy. So this is actually a great gift to the rich man. He's been offered the circumstances to reflect on his humanity, to learn of his own suffering. There is no bridge that allows you to escape your story. There is no, that's where the gaping chasm is. If we think there's an escape route from our humanity and our suffering and our story, we're sorely deceived. And yet, we constantly try to create a bridge to nowhere. We constantly try to create an escape from being vulnerable. I really admire the research of Brené Brown. After receiving degrees in social work, she did tons of research, including thousands of interviews and working groups, study groups, and she became haunted by the realization that those she interviewed could be placed in kind of two groupings. Everyone had problems in their lives. There wasn't anybody she interviewed that didn't have an issue or a struggle that they had, or some heartbreak, some suffering. But there were those who miraculously lived through and were living through their challenges and experiencing them as life-producing ways of being present. And then there were those who were not doing well, were lashing out, who were avoiding the reflection upon their own suffering, their own grief, their own humanity, their own frailty, and they weren't doing so well. And so she labeled one group as those who understood their worthiness. They were worthy, they felt a sense of belonging, and they felt a sense of love. And how did they do that? She concluded they did that by embracing their vulnerability. And so all of her research turned to understanding why people avoided vulnerability. Now, she didn't want to study vulnerability. It was way outside her scope as a scientist. Scientists are about theories and conclusions and the strategic structures that help you understand the world, and you stuff everything in that. But what drove her was that part of the results of identifying what happens to people that are vulnerable, she understood that vulnerability is actually the birthplace of joy, creativity, gratitude, and love. Vulnerability is the place where we connect with one another. There's this great scene in her TED Talk where she asked the gathered people in the lecture hall how many people want to be vulnerable. No hands go up. And she also asked them, who do you feel most connected to? People that are perfect or portray themselves as perfect or not broken or whatever, or those who are broken? Every last one of them raised their hands. I relate to brokenness. So there's a chasm between people who know that the people you resonate with are vulnerable people, and yet an unwillingness to be vulnerable yourself, because it's a frightening thing. She says it's frightening because it pulls us deeper into shame, that we feel shame. We feel shame that we're not good enough. We feel shame that we're not this enough or that enough. Or maybe a shame about something that's happened to us. or something that we feel at the deepest level, if you really knew my story, you wouldn't like me. Right? You wouldn't want me to belong in your community. And we know that's why we're here. We're here to be vulnerable. And so, how do we get out of this cocoon to set ourselves free? How do we transform ourselves? By extending a little kindness to yourself. By reflecting on what you've been through, and you've been through so much. Saying, wow, that hasn't felt very good. Not by rejecting it or pushing it away, because we know the simple truth. If we do not have compassion for ourselves, there is no way we can have compassion for another human being. We can pretend. We can pretend to have that compassion. We can do acts of service. We can do things we know we ought to do. We can function out of guilt. Or we can connect. And we connect through vulnerability, through an embracing of our true story, our real story, which has suffering in it. We know this. Love your neighbors as you love yourself. Jesus always connected that sense of self-love with loving, the act of loving your neighbor. They have to go together. You cannot ignore the depths of your feelings and expect to have any impact in a world that is also ignoring the depth of what they're feeling. Every time you take a flight, you hear this too. Put your own oxygen mask on first. But Brown says we don't do this because we are simply afraid to be vulnerable even to ourselves. We justify this fear of self-discovery by a storehouse of defense mechanisms. The most popular one is, guess what it is? Others have it more difficult than I do. Now here's what I want you to do. Every time you want to say that, call it for what it is. Utter avoidance of your suffering. Utter avoidance of your grief. Utter avoidance of your deepest feelings. Don't pay attention to me. I'm not paying attention to me, and I don't want to pay attention to me because it's too painful. I'm afraid that it will exclude me, make me feel worthless, disconnect me. And that is the challenge. That we don't want to be that isolated rich man. We want to be like Lazarus. We want to say, I know what it's like to suffer. Because every person is suffering. Every one of us. Every one of us has brought some suffering here this morning. Suffering for ourselves, suffering for our relationships, suffering for feeling lost or depressed. Don't judge yourself. Welcome yourself. Hold yourself. Be kind to yourself. She found that people that are willing to take that step and to deepen their story and their connection with themselves, to be kind to themselves, find connection. And connection to one another is what gives us meaning and purpose. But we cannot connect very well with others if we cannot embrace our own vulnerable nature. Amos talks about those with their ivory beds and, living in luxury. All that's for show. We don't. I don't care what we may think of people that seem to have it all, but it's surface. It says nothing about the real story of another human being. And for me, my mind went to the ivory tower. I've lived in an ivory tower. I've tried to feel good about myself by my accomplishments or what I've studied or where I've been or what I've done. And it's a paradigm. It's a paradigm to keep me away from the very earthy, real places of brokenness in my own life. But it's those places that open up joy and freedom. And those places are exactly where we need to be. In fact, did you know courage comes from the Greek word or the Latin word cure, and the word itself means heart and heartfelt expression of your story. Courage. That takes courage. It doesn't take courage to pretend you're okay. That's cowardice, actually. Courage is something when you can embrace your story. And we've lost connection, folks, from one another. It's not entirely our fault, but I mean, the pandemic has had its way with us. It's isolated us, and we are hurting. And we need to find a way to walk together again. And what a beautiful symbol the labyrinth is. Because as much as we'd like to walk directly to the center of it, that's not how you get there. You do this screwy little path, back and forth, and you know what? You're not alone because we're all on that path. And that's the beautiful thing about community. This place welcomes our real stories, our messy stories, our difficult stories. Those stories heal us all. They bring us all together. And, you know, if we only had a good example of vulnerability, how about Jesus, naked on a cross, a place of shame? It's the focal point of the journey. It's where resurrection happens. It's where we don't demand someone come back from the dead so we can believe. It's where we die to our paradigms. And we are the ones that get resurrected. If I remember correctly, he did that as a radical invitation. To let our shame go, to learn to love ourselves as God does, and to embrace our vulnerability so that we can connect anew to ourselves, to each other, and to God.